if we were to be in a failing bank and they had to come in and exercise and use federal insurance, do you think they would cover something illegal? I don't think so. But SAFER will change that. SAFER will not let them exclude the industry, which I think is a great thing for the industry. So there is a lot of benefit to SAFER.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen and Vinny. And this week, we got a very special guest, Sundie Fried, CEO and President of Safe Harbor. Sundie, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's good to be back.
Excited to see you. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Really excited to talk to Sundie about banking and regulations and rescheduling. I think we got a lot of really cool topics. And I think I'm even more excited that she's located in Colorado. So fellow Coloradoan and West Coast vibes, right? How are you, Brian?
That's great. And I think it's super important to always talk about where someone currently is, but it's always important to know where they grew up. So Sundie, if we had to talk about like East Coast, West Coast, could you tell us where you grew up?
Well, I did grow up in upstate New York, so I am definitely a New Yorker by birth.
Let the record reflect, Kellen. But nice try, though. So before we dive in, can you give a little background about yourself and kind of how you found your way to the cannabis space?
Well, I'll tell you, it was never anything planned. Anything I've done in this last 10 years has been a complete surprise to my entire career. I got into banking in 1983. And now I'm really aging myself, fellas. And I liked it. It was a good fit for me. I like numbers, and I started in actually IT, and it was in Germany with a credit union over there, Service Credit Union. And I just stayed with them from 83 to 95, worked my way up to branch manager, training, and then VP of marketing, which I never understood why they put me in marketing. And then I got it, toward the end of my career, I'm like, okay, I am an idea girl after all, right? So, and I proved that with Safe Harbor when we started that. But when I came back to the States, I came operations, and then I went to CEO at Partner Colorado. And I was getting ready to retire in 2014. Truly, I was going to retire at the same time my husband was retiring, and we thought we would just go into marital bliss, huh? At the end of careers. And I don't know that it would have been good for us to retire at the same time. So in hindsight, I don't think anyone ought to make that decision together like that. But I was out with a couple lawyers in Denver. And they started talking to me. They said, let me take you to drinks one night. And I said, okay, why not? I can talk to you about marijuana because, of course, that's what we called it in 2014, right? And they said, why won't you bank our clients? And they had cannabis clients at that point in time. And I'm like, oh, no, don't even talk to me about this. So many financial institutions were jumping in, trying to get into it, do it right, and then moving out of it, right? So it was a scary endeavor to even think that I could do something that others were not doing, let alone that would extend my life and my job. No retirement. And then the more I learned, I couldn't unlearn it. The more I learned what it's like to do business in cash, the more I learned that they were being forced to bank in a criminal manner. I thought, this is wrong. And as a credit union, you're kind of trained to do what's right for the community. And so I started educating my board. And the most prevailing story that just really got us was they became our first client. They would get up in the middle of the night, pack their kids in their car seats, and they'd go to 3 different ATMs, and they would deposit under $10,000 in each ATM because they were told by their banker, if you go over $9,000, you're going to be flagged and your account will be closed. So that's where I say you're getting banked criminally and you're being told how to skirt the system. And I said, I can't do this. I can't be that banker. And when I told the board all this, they immediately went into, let's do some more research and education. And before you knew it, they said, the only problem is your contract is up. And I wouldn't even let them give me a contract because I wasn't sure I could do it. But I said, I think I can, even though they called me a little crazy at that point. I said, I think I can do it. And the reason I thought I could do it is because I had, 20 plus years of experience with regulators and with auditors. And I said, I'm not delegating this to anybody. If I'm going to prison, it's going to be because I didn't do it right. So I ended up making sure that I wrote all the procedures, policies, and implemented it. And I onboarded the clients for the first 2 years. And I tell you, I wanted to quit. I wanted to quit in January when I launched. But after I interviewed those owners, and they were all legitimate business owners, I thought I was getting mom and pops. I had the same stigma attached to marijuana that everybody else did. And then I realized, wow, this is the real industry that's legal. I couldn't turn back at that point because of the people that were involved in the industry. And that's what kept me going, the people.
I love that. And I think the story about talking about trying to get up the hill in the early days and how hard that is so critical to hear, because I think people sometimes forget we are in such an early stage of the industry. So before you dove in and you're speaking to your board, did you reach out to any of your relationship with the regulators and kind of feel them out and say, hey, like, if we did this, how would you feel about this? Where did you define and lean on your regulations and previous experience in order to figure out where your team can make the biggest difference right away?
Well, it's interesting because when I went to the regulator in Colorado, because you don't do anything without talking to your regulators, especially something in a high risk business like this. I went to him and I just expected him to say, oh, no, don't go down that path. I've seen other credit get themselves in trouble and over their heads. And I went in and I just figured I would make the best attempt. And I go in and I'm like, I'm going to have a conversation and report back to my friends. Can't do this. And he gives me a handful of papers and he said, somebody needs to do it. Go do it. Right. And I'm like, that's not the right answer. That's not what I was expecting. But he later told me there were like 3 CEOs in the state of Colorado he actually really knew could get down to the details of it, very operationally based. And he said I was one of those CEOs. He was just waiting to come in the door. And he talked to my board and he said, I've got to get this done. The governor wants this done. Colorado needs to be safer. And he said, so I'm going to be the regulator that walks right by your side, learning everything you learn, and we'll get this done together. So he took the regulator threat out of it, so long as I did the hard work, and I did. But I talked to our federal insurer, NCUA. I talked to my CPA. I was going in transparent. If you folks don't want me doing this, kick me out fast because I don't want to get into something and get shut down. So the transparency is one of the things that really worked in favor of Partner Colorado Credit Union moving in this direction.
For our audience, could you just kind of briefly describe the difference between the regulator at a state level versus a federal level from like a banking perspective and like a credit union perspective, just to like set the landscape a little better for everyone?
Sure. And a lot of people thought we were a state chartered credit union. So everybody thought because we were state chartered that we could do this and federally chartered couldn't do this. But that's not the truth. It was illegal at either level. It was just you were subject to prosecution, whether you were state chartered or federally chartered. And the fact of the matter is, we are federally insured, like FDIC and CUA. So we still are subject to federal law. So the biggest concern at the federal level we had was, will they revoke our insurance certificate? Will the entire membership no longer have federal insurance because we're going into cannabis, which is why I went to see them. And they made no threat of that whatsoever. So even if you're federally chartered or state chartered, you were still subject to the rules of bank secrecy. And that's the regulation we all feared, getting fined at that level. So I really studied that regulation a great deal. But federally chartered and state chartered, it really doesn't matter because there were federally chartered institutions who were trying to do it at the same time and have done it since 2014 when I got into it as well.
Has there been clarity on that rule so that there's more transparency, or does it still remain the same?
Still the same. Can you believe it? So I know everybody's like, are you really excited about SAFER or Safe Banking Act? And I said, well, so far, so good 10 years later, right? It hasn't made a difference other than there are things that are not tested. Like, is there federal insurance coverage for cannabis industry? I don't know that there is, because if you were to have, but where does that come into play? Only if your bank fails, right? So you want to have a solid banking partner in that situation that's not losing a lot of money, not under a lot of scrutiny. And that's where that comes into play. But if we were to be in a failing bank and they had to come in and exercise and use federal insurance, do you think they would cover something illegal? I don't think so. But SAFER will change that. SAFER will not let them exclude the industry, which I think is a great thing for the industry. So there is a lot of benefit to SAFER. The other thing SAFER will do is actually, there are some Federal Reserve systems that are a little skittish about taking cannabis money. In fact, we've had only one Federal Reserve deny us an account. And I don't know why. They are doing it for other people at this point in time, but we haven't gone back to that well. And in SAFER, I don't believe they're going to be able to exclude us. So again, there's a lot of good things in SAFER, and they won't come after us and prosecute us just because we're banking cannabis. So those are some good things.
What are some of the bad things?
It doesn't really open the banking industry the way I think the industry would like to think it will. Because what keeps financial institutions at bay is bank secrecy. And if that doesn't change, you're still under the level of bank secrecy scrutiny. And those obligations are severe, as well as the penalties for not doing it correctly. So, it's kind of like you do a lot more reporting on cannabis industry. But it's, this is where that whole deregulation or descheduling or rescheduling comes into play. And the fact is that descheduling doesn't deregulate, because again, bank secrecy says this is how you handle high-risk businesses. And this is still how you handle casinos or check cashers, again, or grocery stores, gas stores, tobacco shops. All these are high-risk businesses that, require a lot more compliance work in the background to do it correct and avoid any enforcement actions. And I don't believe that they will change that, because there's still a great deal of black market activity out there in the industry. And until we minimize the black market and optimize banking, which is a determining factor. If you can't get a bank account, law enforcement just has to say, why can't you get a bank account, right?
So do you think that descheduling helps mitigate the black market?
I think that no. I think that descheduling won't. I think what really happens, I think rescheduling is the next step. I really support that for the industry, because I think even more important than SAFER banking, that will assist the growth of the industry and solidify the industry legitimately. And I think that's important, because it takes away the tax burden that they have now under IRS regulations. And that will help them actually grow and support their own growth. And let's be honest, the more money they can make on the bottom line, the less they're subject to any kind of, selling out the back door or black market activities or illicit considerations, right? So, there are reasons to help the industry along. I think that what will minimize black market activities is like in Colorado, where they're getting a lot of the tax money, very successful program they put into place. And they use a lot of that money in law enforcement to seek down the bad actors. The state has to crack down on the bad actors. So that's why you see California having a difficult time, and you see New York having a difficult time, because haven't they just kind of turned their head the other way for so many years? Now, how do you undo that? That's going to be the difficult part. I always say when people talk about this, you're going to have to go back to, you may be too young to remember this, but when we were kids, they had these frying pans and they put an egg in it and they'd fry it on TV, and like, this is your brain on drugs. Now they have to go back to that and say, this is your brain on illegal drugs, regulated drugs, right? They've got to support the industry one way or another and crack down, I think, and utilize some of that tax dollar to actually minimize black market activities. And they can find them.
Does descheduling open up banking, as a lot of people have kind of made claims out there, right? I know that it helps with the tax burden from a 280E perspective. And I did speak with like a PR representative of Wells Fargo, and he said that they would never even touch it until descheduling happens. Are there other steps that need to happen after descheduling for that to kind of solidify from an institutional perspective?
No, again, descheduling, rescheduling, I think is
reschedule. Yeah, that's a better term for sure.
I think that will, get some more banks looking at it, but then you go back to the fact that bank secrecy isn't changing.
Can you just describe what bank secrecy is?
So bank secrecy is regulation that's been decades in the making, right? And what it really states is that illicit money is going to help us find criminals, but the banks are responsible to help find the illicit money. So somebody comes in, they're putting money in, we are responsible for all the money they're putting into their account. Do we know it's legitimate? Do we know they're licensed? Do we know they're not doing any criminal activities on the side? So cannabis is one of those gateway drugs, let's put it that way. If they're going to be doing some illicit activities in cannabis, they might also be doing human trafficking or arms sales, right? This is what they're looking for. So bank secrecy says, banks, you're going to report all this information to us so that we can help find the criminals across the country. It's where the banks have a relationship with a government agency called FinCEN to protect the American financial system as well as Americans. That's the whole idea of bank secrecy. And that's the most important part of banking high risk industries.
When we talk high risk, we're talking casinos, we're talking gas stations, potentially laundromats. Anyone dealing with cash is grouped into the secrecy aspect because anyone who's dealing with cash may also be in trafficking and guns. Is that kind of like the concept is they want to make sure that any cash that is available, it's tracked. But wouldn't banking then be more important and easier to follow if, let's say, there is a digital process to follow with like credit cards?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The more documentation, the more you can digitize your transactions, the more that it can be traced. But then it's kind of like who really gets all those, arms that shouldn't be out there. They're not doing it in a legal way. That's where the cash comes in, right? So if criminals are going to try to keep cash out of the system so that we don't find them, so that we don't scrutinize them. When they put millions of dollars in cash through us into our financial institutions, we're asking them questions all the time. We're forcing them to show the legitimacy of that money. So I once met with a prosecutor from the DOJ in Washington, and 2 hours of, are you really going to put me in jail? What's my prosecution risk and all that kind of thing, and he admitted that, I wrote a book, again, transparency is what I use to stay in the business. And he says, I wondered about whether we could prosecute you and whether a U.S. attorney could come after you. Nothing you really want to hear, right? But you got to hear it. You got to know your risks. And he says, until I read the book. And he said, then I realized that you were doing it for the right reason to protect, the consumers, protect the states, protect the financial system. And he says, I don't think they could. One of the very last questions I asked him was, do you really think the cartel are getting money into the credit union? Do you really think they're slipping money in? Because what do you think my risk is there? Again, asking about risk. And he said, because you scrutinize the money so much, because you make them validate the money so much and you're focused on the money, I think they'll stay away from you. So again, right, where are they going to go unless they find a financial institution that has lax BSA obligation implementation? That's why you have regulators that go in regularly and look at these banks and credit unions to make sure we're not doing something so high risk that puts everybody else's money at risk.
Isn't this where the system is flawed? You're doing all this research, doing all this investigative work, and you're not touching the plant. All you're doing is making sure that someone has the ability, like you said, to not take their 3 kids in the middle of the night to deposit $9,000 in 10 different ATMs. Aren't you doing exactly what the system is designed to do? And isn't that part of the problem when can't you communicate that to regulators and say, hey, this is why they have to do this, these regulations. If we adjust these, then people don't have to do this. Is there any way that those conversations land or they fall on deaf ears?
Well, if we go back to the fact that, illicit activities usually breeds more illicit activities, then they're going to keep their eye on the cash, and you can't blame them. I once went to a meeting and the DEA was there. I had some interesting times in the last 10 years, and we were one of the only, I think there were 2 financial institutions in Colorado that were doing this, and we were at this big session. The regulators were there, the DEA, law enforcement, everyone. And finally, I put my hand up and I said, I have a question for the fellow from the DEA. Is this money better banked or unbanked, right? And he admitted that what we do in bank secrecy helps them do their job immensely. But then he said to me, but if you're going to bank, and this is funny, there's a real funny ending. if you're going to bank marijuana, then you're going to go out there and bank heroin and cocaine. And okay, but here's the funny thing now. And we all just laughed, like, again, the gateway drug to banking bad. But now psilocybin is coming to the forefront, right? Nobody wants to touch psilocybin. And I'm like, but it's legitimately, legal in, now 2 states, right? Somebody's got to bank it.
I can only imagine when you walked into that room and you saw the DEA, if you wondered if this was the time where they were going to say, "Hey, we've got you here."
I think for the first 2 years, I constantly looked over my back, and I believe that I was under some pretty severe scrutiny, from the federal agencies to see if I was, taking any kickbacks, because I have met. When I onboarded the clients for the first 2 years so that I could learn the industry, know the people, and, kind of regulate who's coming in the door. And I had this one fella who tried to give me some marijuana. Hey, I was at his grow, and he's like, "What if a little bird flew over your car and dropped some really good," he said something else, I'll say stuff, "in the back of your trunk?" And I'm like, oh no, don't do that. And he really tested my resolve on whether I would take any kind of product or anything. And he did become a client, but he also trained our bankers on some illicit activities to watch for. I think he was testing me because he knew there were bankers in town who were taking kickbacks to bank the money secretly. And it does happen. So, I think they wanted to be in a legitimate banking program as much as we wanted legitimate owners in our program.
It's wild to me that you have to take all of this risk, again, like Brian said, when you're not touching the plant. And in essence, I kind of look at it from an analogy perspective as like enforcing like a speed limit, right? Like we have speed limits because if you drive too fast and kill someone else, it impacts their life. And now with these industries operating, there's so much more cash now on the street that it's going to create opportunities that can destabilize communities, right? Like gang activity, all these other things that are linked to large amount of cash. And you're, in essence, kind of playing the speed limit enforcer by creating and monitoring the system that's helping get all the cash off the street and kind of help the community. So it's a really interesting dynamic. Have you been able to kind of like express this to regulators? Have you had kind of open conversations about that?
Oh, yeah. So during the first 7 years of the program, we went through 16 or 17 state and federal examinations. And oddly enough, even though we're state chartered, the feds took over. They were the ones who were scrutinizing the program more than anybody. But they were learning. They were learning off of, a financial system that wasn't taking any of this money legitimately to somebody who was taking this money legitimately. So they grew with us, but not without a lot of debates. One of the first debates we had that I remember was we had probably 200 dispensaries that we were banking at this one time. And one of the regulators or examiners comes in and she's like, "We want your bankers, private bankers, to go on site to every one of these dispensaries and risk rate each dispensary." And I said, "No way." I said, "You just put us out of business." I said, "You want our eyes on the money or you want our eyes on the product?" The product regulators are the state regulators issuing license. That's their job. We are working with the state to make sure they're licensed. We're watching the money. And you know what? They didn't disagree, but those are the types of things we had to discuss during 16 examinations, which way to do it and which way was right.
It's just wild. Like you're essentially teaching them how to do their job, or essentially where the line is in the sand between what is your job and what is their job.
Yeah, well, but isn't that the truth about anything new? That's why, as we know, you've been in the industry long enough, and somebody told me right from the beginning, education is key to success in cannabis, right? And so I was prepared. I'm like, fine, I'm going to be the educator, and my senior team became the educator, and we made sure we understood everything, and we did educate, and we educated. What they did, though, I will say that as painful as it was, and it was painful, In fact, the last exam, I only lost my temper one time in an examination. And it was like exam number 14, where, I was tired of being penalized. And they brought some neophyte in who really knew bank secrecy, but didn't know anything about cannabis. And she literally looked right at my employees and said, you guys are money launderers. You're doing something illegal here. And, kind of talked down to them and probably put one of them in tears. And I went in that boardroom and I looked at her and I said, I want you to take this personally. I never want you in my office again. We've been doing this for 7 years now. We have a clue of what we're doing, and it's not illegal in Colorado, which means we're doing something for the state. Boy. And then I had to go back and apologize to the regulators the next day. You know what they said to me? You were bound to lose it at some point in time with all the scrutiny that you've been under. So regulators are not our friends, but they're not the enemies. They're there to protect the financial system and find the rogue players who don't want to do things by the rule. And I'm like Miss Rule Follower.
So then how do we put ourselves in alignment with them to figure out solutions going forward? Is it collaborative educational process? And then if the answer is yes, what would you change if you could make any recommendations in order to improve where we are today to uplift some of these challenges?
Well, I spent probably the first 7 or 8 years doing nothing but educating regulators, not only in my own shop, but I would go to FDIC seminars and everybody, it was all about education. And the interesting thing is when I first tried to get into NCUA and I said, let me come to DC, let me educate, let me tell you how transparent we're being and how we're protecting the system. They said, no, we're not allowed to have any kind of webinar formally because it's illegal. So I think that the regulators are in a good place now. I think that in the 10 years that, it's popped up in enough states that they've got to know what they're looking at this point in time. And the standards in banking have been set. They have been set. The golden standard is there. Now I look at my staff and I say, we probably can loosen up a little, that we're over compliance, right? So I think that's not the problem. I think it really is in legislation and, on the political side of acceptance. And there's just so many different opinions there. I really did think that something was going to pass before the election cycle. I was really disappointed for the industry something didn't. I really thought they might need the votes, and who knows, the Republicans may need those votes soon.
Both sides could use those votes. So just continuing on, cannabis banking and Visa and MasterCard. If cannabis is allowed to bank from safer, can Visa and MasterCard still play, or they have to do some other regulation or other changes to happen?
So if you go back to the financial system, and I'm not from Visa or MasterCard, but I think that I understand the financial system enough. You can go out there as a broker and you can put those little card machines anywhere, right? And it's a matter of how you represent to MasterCard and Visa or other major credit cards. In other words, this is really, a flower shop, literally, not far off from a cultivation, right? It's a flower shop, and they'll categorize it that way. But that's really lying to the financial system. It's really lying and misrepresenting. So what MasterCard and Visa then do is they take on the risk of not knowing where that money really is coming from. It's not coming from a gift shop or a true flower shop, and that money isn't being derived. So how do they know it's being monitored before it gets put into the system, right? And so if you go to safer, that may not change it. It may have to go all the way to deregulation unless some of that ominous, compliance is taken off them and bank secrecy is changed. It's what responsibility. If they get hit, some of the fines out of FinCEN for not knowing the money going into the system are upwards of $100 million if you look up enforcement actions. Nobody wants to pay that kind of fine. So they have to be cautious or it hurts in a deep pocket level.
Is there any credit card secrecy that needs to go on, just like the bank secrecy?
No, I think it really boils down to the money, and they're moving money into the system and they're digitizing, whatever is coming out of whatever shop. And it really boils down to how do you make sure every one of the machines where it's going to take their card recognition and take it into a digitized transaction so they know exactly what they're, putting through the system.
Is this all established on a state level? Because I know, like in Colorado, you can't pay with a credit card, but in some other states, I've been able to pay with a credit card. Is that, or is it just kind of a location to location thing? Maybe I'm not going to the right locations. Is that, can you speak on that a little more?
I don't believe in the major credit cards have made it very clear that we're not supposed to use them for any cannabis product across the country. So there, it's a matter of them finding it and blacklisting it and saying, this isn't the appropriate way. Now, will they let us use a debit card? So I can, if I give my clients a debit card so they can go out and pay their bills and, go to Home Depot and get dirt or whatever they need, that's one thing. But taking money and in a merchant processing environment where they're paying for it, that's not allowed right now. If you're going in someplace, they might have a workaround where you're actually funding a little account from your MasterCard and then paying from this application. Or they have a workaround so MasterCard doesn't actually know, or Visa doesn't really actually know that it's in a cannabis shop. And usually in that case, how you know is the receipt doesn't actually say ABC Cannabis Shop. It says something else altogether. And that's the difficult one to weed out.
I think the most fascinating aspect of it is the fact that I had two friends go recently to New York stores. One went to a legal store, had to pay cash, was uncomfortable with the fact of paying cash. And I had another one who went to a gray market store, paid a credit card, and didn't recognize it was illegal. And having to explain to both of them how it works was super fascinating. And I'm trying to get your opinion on that. So what can I say to the public on that, saying like, hey, if you use a credit card, it's likely an illegal shop? Is that like the way we're going to have to define this so people can recognize the difference between illicit and legal?
Well, that's interesting because I know there are some legitimate shops who are using, they call them cashless ATMs.
Yep.
So, yeah. And there are legitimate shops that are using those cashless ATMs, and they have found a way into the system. But I will tell you that I also know that Visa and MasterCard are very actively looking for those machines. And what we see and what we tell our clients is, you might get away with it for a little while, but let's have a backup plan. There are closed loop systems. You can put a legitimate ATM in your shop. If they find you, you're going to get shut down. So it's not something you necessarily want to count on long term. It just depends.
What about banking differences between hemp versus cannabis? Is there any differences from a regulation standpoint? How does that work? Do you have any big hemp clients? How does that work?
It's more difficult to get a hemp account than it is to get a cannabis account somewhere.
What?
Why?
Really? Why?
Because there are so many checkpoints on cannabis, right? So highly regulated at the state level. If you have a license at the state, you're reporting everything to the state. In hemp, what do they want to know? When your crop comes due, right? And that you're under 0.3. But what about now that they're pulling these derivatives, Delta 8, Delta 9, and they're intoxicating? And they're selling it at gas stations and they're putting it in drinks at restaurants. And it's not regulated, but it can fall into the hands of minors. So that becomes the real big problem here in unregulated, intoxicating derivatives from the hemp environment. And so this is the big argument. I went to a big regulator conference and they're like, how do we do this? This is not on equal ground. Cannabis is over here being highly regulated with an intoxicating. Alcohol is being regulated with intoxicating substances. But now you've got intoxicating, delta substances out of hemp, and they're not regulated because there's a loophole in the Farm Bill. So we've made it very clear that we can't, bank anyone who is producing those derivatives in an unregulated environment. So that's where it becomes difficult. Now, if they're just cultivators, we probably can bank them, and we do have hemp accounts, not a lot, but ones that we can trust and know that aren't actually doing the manufacturing as well.
Have you ever had any clients that you had to terminate mid-relationship just based on a feel or any information that came by?
So, this is the thing about bank secrecy and what's really important about it. People think that bank secrecy is all about keeping them out of the financial system. And that's really true. But a good bank secrecy program finds them as well. They slip in. Look how long we've had money launderers in the system, right? They slip in. The bank's obligation is to find that person slipping in. So a sign of a good program is that you do find somebody. And yes, we start to recognize. The question is, how do you terminate that relationship safely for everybody? But again, if somebody's doing something criminal and you're saying you're too high a risk business for us, they're usually not going to fight it. They don't want to have, reports out there in terms of getting kicked out of a financial institution as well.
It must be a really difficult balancing act, right? One where maybe first you have some suspicion and then you kind of do some research. Is there ever a time where it's a little too gray, even in a gray area where you're like, listen, like, I don't know if you are or you're not. I'm not assuming you are, but just because of the situation, we have to move in a different direction?
Absolutely. Yes. When we can't explain something, we must take action of that nature to protect the financial institution and the system. Yeah. So again, that's the whole suspicious, process. If you're a legitimate licensed operation to support the sales of the money that you're putting into the financial institution, it's there. That's why I say it's easier for a cannabis shop to process their money, because I know what you're telling the state. I see what's in your point of sale. You see how you're paying your taxes, right? I see all these points of validation that show me you're legitimately putting legitimate money into the system. That's my obligation to make sure the money's legitimate.
So banking has partially changed over the last 10 years since cannabis regulation has started. Where do you see the industry from a banking perspective going in the next 10 years? Is it going to continue to open up slowly? Is it going to continue to be like a hyper regulated industry with all of these touch points required, even once hopefully maybe federal legalization occurs or something like that? Like, what do you think is the future of the next 10 years of banking right now?
I think until the cash is so decreased. And, the younger generation may be the generation that takes a lot of the cash out of the system. I often tell the story. If my husband goes out and buys me wine, he buys which is rare. Okay.
He should buy you wine.
He pays for it in cash. Why? This older generation doesn't necessarily want everything on a statement. They don't want to digitize it, right? They don't want people scrutinizing their business. So there's still a very big cash industry out there until maybe the next generation comes in and says, I don't want to carry cash. I want to do this digitally or whatever. And we have full legalization and the major credit cards enter the business. I think then the scrutiny may go down so long as the cash goes down. It really is dependent upon how much cash comes into a financial institution. If you get a financial institution that has 10 times more cash than the one down the street, the obligations are going to be greater on the one who's taking the cash. So the preference of the financial institution is to find those entities and operations that deal less and more digitally, more business to business, more ACH, more transactions that are digitized than is our cash. And a lot of that you already see in cultivators. The biggest cash element is obviously in dispensaries, right? Product retail. So those are the ones who have the higher risk. So somebody who doesn't want the risk can say, I'm only going to bank cultivators over here. So you see, they'll find a way to do what's easier that protects the financial system and the financial institution. And then, eliminate the rest. We won't do the rest. It's like a lot of people or a lot of financial institutions will bank an ancillary company, a service provider, but won't bank, a plant touching entity.
There's got to be education there too, right? Because for them to understand the differences or the unique differences means you need to have an organization like yourself that is more creative with saying, okay, there's differences here and we need to understand how them all play together. Because we've had experiences where insurance providers said, hey, you're a cannabis company. We know you don't touch the plant. We know you just do content, but you're a cannabis company. So what is necessary from an educational standpoint? Is it federal guidance? Is it like where's the education start and who's responsible for adhering to that?
It falls to the financial institution. You don't do it right, you pay the price. So the regulation, I don't believe, is going to lighten up, not severely. Like maybe they're going to require fewer reports. There are things they can do. Their limits can be changed. But again, if they're looking for criminals and they're looking, across the country, that's their charter, right? How do you have the DOJ do their charter if we take away their tools? So that's how we're working in conjunction with them. It boils down not to necessarily education with financial institution, but resources. How much do they want to spend on compliance? At what point is it not profitable? We have, over 700 accounts. We have enough volume that it makes it profitable for us to do the business. But if somebody's just in a community and they say, I have 25 accounts, And I've got to do all this compliance back here now and have so many people having eyes on the business. It becomes a non-profitable business for them to enter into the business. You have to have sufficient volume to support the demands of compliance.
Wouldn't it be beneficial for a large player like Visa or MasterCard then to look down and say, hey, there's a big financial opportunity here? Or do you think in their mind they are fearful that the upside does not weigh the downside, which is getting slapped by the regulators with a massive $100 million fine?
Here's what I've said to somebody from one of the major credit cards. I said, you ought to do a test and do it with Safe Harbor, because we're watching every dollar going into those accounts, right? So they could go in selectively like that if they can get the comfort up. So we continue to work on that direction. That says if you trust the financial institution that's banking that entity, you should be able to trust that when we put machines in there, it's good money.
Were they open to that, or did they have like, hey, I'm not really sure?
It's one of those things where if people have taken such a strong stand for so many years, moving that to a different position is difficult, and especially in a large organization, but we keep trying.
Explaining flip-flopping, right? That's a tough one for everyone.
The new facts are hard.
How much influence do you think some of like the bigger industries potentially get involved, like big pharma, big tobacco? I know that big alcohol, big tobacco have made investments into the industry, but they haven't fully gotten involved. How much of an influence do you think that has on the financial sector?
Well, I think that, they already know how to do business in those types of sectors, right? It has a big influence. Again, when it comes to banking and finance, it's really going to boil down to how do you manage the cash? How do you eliminate the cash? And that's really what it's going to boil down to in the end. So if they can take the cash out of the business, they can lower the risk.
What question do you wish more people asked you?
I think the education process really comes in at that level when you get the new clients coming in saying, what type of compliance and why are we held to a higher standard? What I like to tell them is that, in the very beginning, we help legitimize your business. When you flow through a compliant financial program or banking program, the regulators know that you're doing something. When you're so much in cash and not getting a bank account, why is compliance important to you? We help legitimize them. They could produce statements. They could produce financial statements once they have bank account statements and banking activity. So, the compliance is necessary. Why the compliance is necessary, I think, is the thing that is probably least understood out there.
How much how much does that benefit from an accredited investor standpoint? Do you guys get investors calling you, questioning some of the potential clients that they're looking to fund? Is that some of the relationships that you manage?
That's a really good question. I know that's what you're supposed to give me, but that's absolutely. Investors will question, being in the financial services, obviously we're not allowed to release anybody's name. Financial privacy says your privacy with a financial institution is secure. Can't tell you who's banking here. But if they're working with investors, they can tell the investor where they're banking. And yes, it makes a big difference. If you're investing in a company, you definitely want to know they have legitimate bank accounts. Absolutely. The same thing goes if you're going to put a pool of investors together. Let's say you put a couple $1 million together of investors, or tens of millions of dollars together of investors. You want to know that you're not going to take on one client or one investment that could put everything at risk. You only need one bad player in that pool to really throw everybody's money at risk.
The challenges in cannabis is just, they're endless, right? Like you've got these poor people who are starting their business. They're super excited to get started. They got their license. They're getting their dispensary up. Then they go to open up a spot and they're like, all right, I need a bank account. All right, can't do this. It's mind blowing. And I feel for some of these people, especially in the newer states, who are trying to get started and they can't even imagine some of the conversations and experiences that you've had.
Well, we are doing business in 41 states at this point in time. So and I hate to make it sound so difficult because we've got it down to a science with 10 years of practice here, and we're going to help them stay out of trouble by being transparent. So I hope I didn't make it sound too bad.
It's not, cannabis has its own challenges. Which states are not you doing business with?
Kansas.
Makes sense.
You said Arkansas?
Arkansas we're doing, yeah. Missouri.
South Carolina?
Yeah. So there's a lot of also remember there's a lot of ancillary service providers in other states too, it falls over state lines, but obviously those who are not moving toward legalization don't necessarily have anybody that supports it in state.
What is number one takeaway for people who assume one thing, but they're completely lost on the topic?
Banking is available to the cannabis industry. I think it's a misconception. I think it's been such a fear factor used in lobbying and everything else that people really think it's difficult. If you're doing the right thing, if you're compliant with your state, banking is available to you. Is it more expensive than the normal business? Yes, but the compliance is a lot more difficult. The risk is higher. So you're going to pay a premium for a time being.
I love it. Sundie, for our listeners, they want to get in touch, they want to learn more. Where can they find you?
shfinancial.org. Or you can find me on LinkedIn and I'll get you to the right people.
Awesome. We'll link it up in the show. Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Enjoyed it, guys.